Welcome back to the Public Square and part 2 today of our conversation with Dr. James Carafano on this 1850 Main Street edition. Sometimes we like to give you a peek at what's happening over there. So here's the program.
Real questions, real answers for real life. Come on in and pull up a chair. You're at 1850 Main Street with Michael DelGiorno and David Zanotti.
The conversation with Dr. James Carafano continues today as we discuss how what's happening in Israel now could affect all of us.
Well, that's interesting you would bring up 73 and the irony that the Golda Meir movie just came out.
Right.
Revisiting that very question. And the discussion there was whether or not Israel would go nuclear back in 73.
Right.
So here's my question. If for most people that are trying to understand this thing, their frame of reference on global conflict is playing a game of Risk.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, it's a board game to them.
Right.
These countries are all next to each other, so to speak. So if they start dropping nuclear bombs on each other, you talked about the targeting plan. What's the impact on the entire region in regards to the health of anybody?
Well, look, what's the impact on Americans? This is the thing is we pretend like this war in Israel is like it's not about us. They just killed dozens of Americans.
Mm-hmm.
There's probably a dozen American hostages. There's a lot of Americans in the Middle East, and they're not going to be able to get up and walk away. We've got a major, air base in the region. We've got ships. I mean, a lot of Americans are just going to die off the bat and forget about all the fallout and the global depression that will follow. And then who's to say where it stops? This is the thing is, where does the madness stop? Well, once you cross that line, where does the madness stop? How can we be so confident that Russia and the United States and China will just stay out of this?
Well, nobody can stay out of the impact of it, right? I mean, if a half a dozen nuclear weapons go off in the Middle East,
right?
What economy and what health structure of what nation is untouched? I mean, how far would you have to run to not be impacted?
Yeah, I mean, look at the humanitarian catastrophe and the but like nobody's just even paying attention to Gaza today. I mean, first of all, even if the Israelis go in for say a week or two, like they did in Castlet or whatever, the population is not going to be able to go back to the north for months, maybe years. I mean, the internal, and nobody wants Gazan refugees, and I think rightly so, right? But the internal displaced population in Gaza is going to be horrific for a really long time. And the problem with aid, of course, is we're going to go back to the same problem we had before, which is how do you know that aid isn't just going to go back to rebuilding the military capacity of Hamas? And that's going to be ugly. Now take that and multiply it by 100-fold for the scenario you just laid out. And remember back to the story about the Pakistanis and the Indians when they actually saw what they could actually do. I'll tell you something else that's scary about nuclear weapons that we don't talk about a lot is, I mentioned that we have targeting analysis that we can tell you, well, here's how many people are going to die or whatever. That's actually not good data. It's all extrapolated mostly from Hiroshima and other kind of above ground tests we did. But the problem with that data is we measured what we can measure, right? You can measure the destructive force. You can measure the electromagnetic pulse. You can measure the spread of radiation. What you cannot measure is the effect of mass fire because we didn't have models that really predicted that.
Right.
And the biggest problem with a nuclear weapon actually is the fire that happens after the fireball. And of course, it's a big difference if you blow it up in the middle of a desert or in the middle of a city. So because of the fireball effect, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, not really good examples because they're both relatively contained areas. In certain urban settings, the destructive effects of a nuclear blast might be 10 times what the target analyst predicts.
What a sobering pause that comment is, especially when you think about the close proximity and where the wind's blowing.
If you think about New York City, for example, so the two planes hitting the Twin Tower, that was about a 2K impact. Now, if that had been a low air burst instead of going into the ground, where most of the impact goes into the ground, everything between the Twin Towers and I forget the name of the bridge, I guess the Brooklyn Bridge, maybe.
Or George Washington, one of the two.
Yeah, would have been blown away.
Yeah.
In reality, as a 2 kiloton low air burst fireball might burn down the entire district of Manhattan and Staten Island and the surrounding areas.
So there are a group of people in this world that are so dedicated to the destruction of the nation of Israel for all the reasons that they are. Do you ever sit and ask if they ever had the power to push the button? And by pushing a button, they could literally eliminate everything that's there. They could take them on. Does anyone ever stop and war game that person having their finger on the button?
Yeah. Well, we used to have this thing, and we still do, I guess. I was in the Army for 25 years. Big part of my career, I was in nuclear weapons. We used to have a thing called two-man control. To actually launch a nuclear weapon, every nuclear weapon requires at least 2 human beings operating completely independently who verify that there's a legal authority to launch. And the reason for that was somebody woke up one day, and I don't know if you've ever seen the movie, the Stanley Kubrick movie, like Dr. Strangelove, where the guy just decides to somebody woke up one day and said, do we really want to
go mad,
have a single point of failure on the use of a nuclear weapon? The answer was no. And so if you're asking me do we ever really want to rely on human judgment or trust or morals to prevent really horrific incidents, then the answer is no. I mean, if I'd have said to you the idea that order people to go and deliberately murder 1,400 people and behead them and set them on fire and kill members of their families, and would you say, well, that's the act of a rational thing? So yeah, I wouldn't depend on that. And of course, people say, well, just get rid of nuclear weapons. Well, just like a gun, it's not the nuclear weapon that's a problem. It's the guy that yields it, right? The answer is there are evil people in the world, and you have to
absolutely
deal with the evil. And if you don't, you reap what you sow.
Now, this is where, and I'm going to do a quick little review so we're all on the same page. We have 3 types of Muslims because we had 3 examples of Muhammad. So he was peaceful, one of 365 religions in Mecca. Then he got political, and then ultimately he got warlike and jihadist. You convert or you die. You convert or you pay a tax and you're controlled, that kind of a thing. We're talking, how many times did we reference Pakistan and they were reasonable and they saw what this would do to them and India. Well, I'll remind you that Pakistan is 76% Sunni. That's not the case in Iran. Also, I'll remind everyone that evil is a matter of perspective. In terms of radical Islam, never mind that they're all intermingled in all these regions. So we can't just say, oh, our war is with the Soviet Union, not the Soviet people, but the Soviet regime. And so we can always, disassociate. These people are all living among themselves. So this is what's problematic in going into a neighborhood. All you can do is say, if you're a peace-loving Muslim, leave in 48 hours. That's what makes this a very difficult war to fight. But what I want to get to is the cooler head. From an Iranian Shia perspective, this is not evil. This is worship. This brings about the hidden imam and the Mahdi and the judgment control for the whole world and then judgment of mankind. This is their calling. That we've never had an enemy with a nuclear weapon who had a over politics, religious worship to do it. That's what I think is lost in all of this conversation, where they won't act like Pakistan.
Well, so the number one reason why the Iran regime would benefit from a nuclear weapon, and we've seen this over and over again throughout history, because the one thing you don't do is go try to meddle with the internal politics. We never try to take down the Russians, right? When the 56 happened in Hungary, we just watched. 68, we just watched. It's the get out of jail free card of repressing your own population. So regime change is kind of off the table, right? And so the biggest losers in this will be the Iranians themselves, because as risk-averse people are now about supporting the Arabian people, which hate their own government, they'll be even more so about that. But, to your point about, people of blind hatred, I think one of the things we have to do is we have to look in the mirror. We have people in the United States of America today who are standing up and cheerleading for Palestinians, chopping off heads of people. And these people are not Muslims. Some of them are Jews.
Oh, no, they're just indoctrinated, socialized. They're what we created in our radical universities.
Yeah. And so I take the point about, we always say, well, it's the regime and not the people. And, but a lot of regimes wouldn't exist if the people didn't permit it. And even the people of Iran, I mean, okay, you've been oppressed for decades. Your freedoms have been taken away. You've been murdered and killed in the streets. But you know what? The reality is your government still stands. And is that my fault? Or is that your fault?
Oh, I get that. By the way, we're not innocent of not meddling. Jimmy Carter did meddle in Iran, in regime, and created the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is the problem we're talking about right now. So I know that's an inconvenient reminder, but
if you ever want a lesson in delusion, and this is the one thing I actually give Jimmy Carter a lot of credit for. Read Jimmy Carter's presidential memoirs, which they did not edit, right? So they published them as they were written. Reagan's memoirs were written for posterity. In other words, he was written to be read after he was president. Jimmy's weren't. And read the part about where the revolution happens, and you read them, it's like, oh, well, people tell me this guy's not so bad. Well, they'll probably be fine. Yeah, we can figure all this out. Carter was so inept.
When you subscribe to 1850 Main Street, you're the first to find out what's happening next with new guests, publications, and events. And when you spread the word about 1850 Main Street, you're helping others find real answers to the real questions facing America right now. To learn more, visit 1850mainstreet.com. And please, tell a friend.
My wife and I were recently sitting around a campfire with friends discussing the issues of the day. Everyone involved in the conversation were parents of grade school children. One dad asked, should we be worried about raising children in today's world? Now that's a question that has been asked for hundreds of years. It was asked during the American Revolution. It was asked during the Holocaust. It was asked during the Civil Rights Movement. And it is still asked today. Asking that question plays into the fear of the moment. As parents, it is our responsibility to raise the leaders of the next generation. The work of the Public Square and the American Policy Roundtable is providing resources to help parents educate the next generation. From Christmas in America to the American Mission Series to YouTube policy briefings, our goal is to provide true truth that can be passed on to others and impact the nation. The work we do would not be possible without the support of listeners such as you. Would you consider a gift today to help educate the next generation of leaders?
So let me ask you a question about, turn the page just a bit. When you look at the debate stage right now on the Republican side of who wants to be the next president, does anybody there impress you that they understand what's really going on here?
Could I make a guess?
Well, I was going to say, in comparison to what, right? So, as Michael will tell you, I don't do politics. I'm not a political guy. I'm just a politician.
Well, I'm just asking on policy. Have you heard anyone articulate an understanding?
I actually think, and I would say this in general, is if you looked at 2016 at the Republican field, people were all over, and there were like 17 candidates. They were all over the place on everything. There was everything from like extreme isolationists to let's bomb the heck everything. If you look at this field in general, this is a much tighter shot group. And the Republican Party has, I think, changed significantly. It's a conservative party. I think what you're largely, and I think I see this on domestic policy and even on foreign policy. And yeah, there are some differences and people have said some stuff and everything. But I think by and large, what you're likely to get from a conservative president is a president who looks at the world in terms of what is in the vital interest of the United States and what's the best way to do that. Might have a bit of debate about that. I think anybody likely to get the nomination is going to have that philosophy. And I think it stands in absolute 180-degree contrast with what we have in the White House now.
That was my question on the follow-up. So when you look at the current administration, because let's treat them both equally. It's not politics. It's about how do we protect ourselves.
Right.
How do you rank the current administration and going forward? What would you think they've got any chance of getting it, or do they already understand?
It's interesting. Well, first of all, it is Obama's third term. And every single, they always talk about Republicans being the isolationists. And the reality is it's always the American left who thinks that the world would be better off without America and wants America to disengage, back off, try to get world equity, right? And Obama did it for 8 years. It was a complete disaster. We've morphed back to that's a complete disaster. What's really interesting to me is anything that goes right in foreign policy in the world today, it's not because of the administration. It's because friends and allies around the world pull the administration in doing the right thing. So, for example, we're doing great with Korea and Japan against China. That's because we have great governments in Korea and Japan, which are anti-Chinese. We would not be fighting the war in Ukraine if it wasn't for the fact that the Ukrainians, Biden said, get on a plane and leave the country, right? So, the only reason why we're doing anything in Ukraine is because the Europeans essentially, and their Ukrainians shamed us into it. We're fighting in Israel because you can't turn your back on Israel, right? But if you look where it requires initiative from the U.S. to do the right thing, it's always absent. Look at the border, look at what's going on in Latin America, look at what's going on in Africa. So if there's not a powerful ally that's really kind of pulling us to do the right thing, our instincts are do nothing.
Well, I also see the fine line. Sometimes, like the president's visit to Israel, you're there, you're saying the right things, but all of your actions prior to your plane trip is what sent the signal of weakness, and weakness emboldens an enemy, which actually created this problem.
Right.
The relationship between Israel and the Biden administration and Bibi Netanyahu, quite frankly, Bibi Netanyahu's relationship with his own country is strained. That's bad for timing. What happened in Afghanistan is bad for timing.
Right.
The only thing I disagree with, this is not Obama's third term. This is Podesta's fifth. He's the common thread in all of it. No, where I was headed was you won't be political, and I get that. That's why I chimed in. I knew that's what the answer you were going to give is. Can I just say this, and then you can just not respond if you don't want to? Of this group, we don't know. We know DeSantis left Harvard and, got his undergraduate, got his Yale law degree, and then went and served 16 years in the Navy. My guess is DeSantis gets foreign policy and would have great judgment. But him aside, you would have to kind of go probably Nikki Haley and Mike Pence. Of the rest, probably have the best grasp of foreign policy. Can we at least talk about who has a resume that would suggest that foreign policy is a priority in an area of strength?
So who had the worst resume for president in American history? It was Abraham Lincoln. Turned out to be a pretty good war leader.
Right.
Donald Trump had a horrific resume for foreign policy. Actually has outperformed, I think, every modern president since Ronald Reagan. I don't think presidents are by resume. And like I said, I don't think if the Americans vote for a Republican president, their expectation is that president is going to put America's interests first. That president's going to secure the border. And so I just think that I'm not worried. I just think American conservatives are not going to elect a president that's not going to look after the American interests of the people and not have that expectation.
How important is this election, not just for the future of America, but for the future of these uncertain regions?
It's kind of like Ali Frazier fight. Like how many body blows can you take before you go down? It's a bit like, well, this is the last that we lose this election. Freedom is. Everybody says that about everything.
Yeah, no, I'm not going there.
But the point is how many hammer blows can you take? To Dave's point, how do you know somebody else isn't just going to blow the whole thing up while you're dorking around trying to get your act together? I just give you a small example of how ridiculous it really has gotten. This administration just announced they're going to normalize relations with Venezuela. Right. So they're going to let Venezuela do exactly what Iran did. They're going to let them pump all the oil they want, make all the money they want. And then in return for that, we're going to get to send election observers to the next election. Like that's going to mean anything. Right. Venezuela today is ground zero for illegal migration in the United States from Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. So if you're in China, you want illegally come to the United States, you fly into Venezuela, they hook you up with the cartels, take you to the border. So Venezuela today is one of the chief sources of some of the most dangerous illegal immigration to the United States coming in. And our response to that is that Biden is going to reward the Venezuelan regime. So how many of these can you take?
Yeah, how many? David asked me a question, and I want to ask his question that he asked me to you. Because I would say this is bad. We've outlined how it can get worse in a hurry. And the worst scenario is not off the table. David asked me, is what's happening right now with Hamas and Israel the tip of the sword, or is there more spear coming? And the assumption is, does that mean Hezbollah from the north? Does that mean Iran? Does that mean Russia, China behind Iran and Hezbollah and Hamas and Islamic Jihad, Muslim Brotherhood, and everybody else thrown in? Or is the rest of the spear potentially an attack here in America? After all, I don't have to tell you how many aliens we did not capture or how many of suspicious interest are in our country. If they wanted to hit us here too, they could. And maybe that's what Iran and Hezbollah is threatening.
Well, I would definitely say in the Middle East, it's Hamas and Hezbollah that if there's one thing the Chinese and the Iranians and the Russians have in common is they're happy to fight to the last Palestinian or to the last fighter in Lebanon. So, and they're just happy to kind of pick up the pieces, right? I don't see any of them getting directly engaged, right? They're going to set fire and like the RSS sit back and watch. Your point about a terrorist attack in the United States is well taken. We just don't know whether there's a lone wolf that's going to get inspired or whether there's a deliberate operation that's in place or going to be put in, or has been put into place that'll be pulled off. Here's the only thing I can tell you that's factually 1,000% correct. And as a person that worked on Homeland Security for 24 years, that from whence I speak, right? We are less prepared today to identify, counter, and respond to a terrorist attack than we were on 9/11/2001. Because in the last 2+ years, this president has literally dismantled or perverted every single instrument that was created after 9/11 to prevent another 9/11. So everything from taking air marshals off of planes to putting them at the border to help process illegal immigrants, to making CBP and ICE the world's biggest human trafficking network, to having the FBI and CIA more focused on, drag queen shows and, going after political enemies than tracking down terrorists. Well, I can't tell you. But if I could tell you what people inside 3-letter agencies were looking at today, you would head for the bomb shelter.
We all grew up 3 Catholic boys. The older I get, the more I return to appreciate. It's David and I had this conversation the other day. It's one of the only denominations that prays specifically for our leaders, regardless of what party, every single Mass. I know from studying John F. Kennedy, when push came to shove over the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a time all you could do, and Americans were lined up outside of churches to get in. This is certainly a time to be very concerned. It's certainly a time to pray for our existing leaders, though they have been failing to get wisdom and in a hurry and for God's mercy and protection. This is a really bad situation that might even be worse by the time somebody overhears this conversation and could get to worst in a real hurry. This is really trouble. Well, let me ask you, I'll close with this question. How much more troubling is this conversation we're having than any we've had in 15 years?
It's like a guy that's gone down the street and how many near accidents have you had? Well, they're all near accidents. So, who knows what the worst would have been. I mean, we've been through this, and me, I'm the eternal optimist.
I know. I wanted to end on that note.
And so I absolutely 100,000% believe America can recover from this if, people do the right thing. You just have to put the right people there and do the right thing. But I want to go back to your point about prayer, because it's one of my favorite presidents is Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower was always a religious man. He never really talked about it when he was in the military. But, what's interesting is he prepared for presidential leadership. One of the first decisions he made, and one of the things he really committed himself to, is one of the most important things he had to do to bring to the American people to help win the Cold War, is he had to bring God back into the public square. And I think that's true today.
You never know who may show up at 1850 Main Street, but one thing is certain. You'll find real answers to the real questions facing America right here. Check out 1850mainstreet.com and subscribe today so you don't miss a single guest or conversation. We'll see you next time here at 1850 Main Street.
Thanks again for listening to this 1850 Main Street edition of The Public Square. To hear more from Michael and Dave on that project, look for 1850 Main Street wherever you get your podcasts, or at 1850mainstreet.com. And we'll see you next time on The Public Square.
The Public Square is a broadcast service of the American Policy Roundtable.